Do you want us to record it then, still? Yes, maybe?
Yes, record it.
Okay.
Did you not record the last one?
No, we did. I just realized I forgot to record the first speech on this one.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, let me read all of them. Alright. So, do you have any actual evidence that points to women, that says women are surveilled more than men?
Yeah, we actually talked about our Chaminade 14 card, which indicates that it says that women and girls are watched without their consent. So it happens in apartments and classrooms.
It also they're watched without their consent, but are men also watched without their consent?
We would say that our affirmative is not just solely screw men, but rather that we're saying that we need to have an analysis of jurisprudence where women have actual access to it in the first place and have a way to engage in sort of politics. We also say that surveillance is problematic because it's deemed in male power.
Only women that are surveilled without?
Yeah, the Chaminade card specifically points out that men are finally feeling the heat of being watched, which means that they're finally seeing that surveillance and the massive gaze is upon them, which is why we're having all these policy reforms, when in reality it's been implicated in women's lives forever.
What do you think that this is caused by, or what's the root cause?
We would say that there's not just one specific root cause of hierarchies. We would say that it's different intersectional oppressions that exist and create this sort of male gaze. We would also say that it's just a creation of society, which is why we need to have sort of a feminist utopian vision in order to get that away.
Alright, does it have to be only a feminist vision?
We would say our feminist utopian vision is specifically key because, I believe it's our McKenna card talks about how regular utopias are always sort of they ignore issues of race, class, and gender, which means that even if we imagine a utopian vision, it's never actually getting the access of including oppression and including a way to actually combat that.
Alright,
yeah.
Thank you. You were just sitting across this that men were starting to feel the heat of the gazes, so wouldn't that mean that they are also being surveilled?
We would say that we would say that it talks about how women spying of women has been going on for centuries, and they're I guess the masculine individual is feeling the sort of gaze that's coming upon. This is the reason why they're having all these reforms for surveillance, because again, women and girls have been watched without their consent, surveyed in every other instance.
If they're having reforms now, even if it is because of males feeling the heat, isn't it still the reform that matters?
Our Chaminade card is really good on this question. It indicates that right now crisis of men getting mad because they're being watched by the NSA and stop collecting my data, NSA, so they do reforms I guess what an NSA app would do. It ignores the fact that women are society.
I get that, but if your app is talking about feminism and that.
Well, it's not just feminism. It talks about gender binaries and how those do. So, we also look forward to discussion of a more, I guess, open form of feminism, which talks about I think that's our Wiki Wilson card, which talks about how this surveillance actually implicates race and class as well, and how this sort of people
if it's surveillance doing this, and right now it is surveillance.
What?
If it's surveillance that is causing this, and right now there is stuff happening to decrease surveillance, and isn't that
all of those same policies are going to be men focused and not allow for women to actually have their opinions and accessibility within the state.
Yeah, that's feminist, utopian, feminist is specifically key. Do y'all want the table?
Yeah, please.
Is your speaker?
It should be
Yeah, hold up, I need to.
My mouth guys, so.
Yeah, also another guy.
All right. What's the order?
What? Yeah. No, it's there. It's just my verbatim is being kind of funky, so it won't have a hat. So
Right. So it's two off, but it looks like it's just one off.
Yeah.
Alright, is the, okay.
I
I see where you are now.
It's somewhere in there. It'll be
The mood
It
part
starts
is the first, right? Or wait.
No. It's the cloud card, the generic one.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's where cast starts. Okay, I'm just gonna put a hat just so I know that things are the same.
So two off.
Two off framework and then cap. You can just leave two off. Two off.
Yeah.
Two off?
Yeah.
Great, Jesus.
Everybody interpretation, the affirmative should be required to read a topical policy proposal and defend its implementation. The affirmative can only weigh advantages that stem from the implementation of a plan. The United States federal government should means the debate is solely about the outcome of a policy established by governmental means. Erickson, 2003. Each topic contains certain key elements. An agent doing the acting. The United States is the United States should adopt. The agent is the subject of the sentence. The verb urges action means to put policy into action through governmental means. The entire debate is about whether something ought to occur. And violation. The affirmative didn't read a topical policy proposal. They leveraged advantages based off the endorsement of the discourse of the theoretical content of the 1AC, not the plan. Framework is a voting issue for fairness in education. Prefer our limits. There are applicable limits because they aren't limited by the topic. Limits are key. Predictable ground for debate is a precondition for actual debate and clash. Those debates are good for education, engagement, and empathy. Only clear rules, a stable topic, and simulation can evolve. Lantis, 2008. Simulations, games, and role-playing events, active teaching and learning, deepening conceptual understandings enable students to actively experience rather than read or hear about the constraints and motivations for action. Exercises capitalize on the strengths of active learning techniques, creating memorable experimental learning events. Political stimulations as teaching and research tools. Simulation stresses opportunities to reflect dynamics faced in the real world by individual decision makers. Role plays provide more leeway for students to think about how they might act. Very useful role play exercises with clear procedures for use of the international studies classroom. Building the simulation design around specific educational objectives, carefully selecting the topic to be addressed, establishing the needed roles to be played, providing clear roles, specific instructions and background material, and having debriefing and assessments plans in place. These methods are particularly effective in bridging the gap between academic knowledge and everyday life, lead to the enhanced student interest in the topic and development of empathy and acquisition for the retention of knowledge. And class is key to productivity. Their method is not conducive to change. Steinberg and Freely, 2008. There must be a difference in opinion before there can be a debate. When there is no clash of ideas, there is no debate. Debate cannot be an effective decision without clear identification of question. It's not likely to be productive or useful without focus on a particular question and identification of line, demarcating sides in the controversy. Vague understanding results in unfocused deliberation and poor decisions, frustration, and emotional distress. Concerned citizens worry about the state of public education could join together to express their frustrations regarding the schools, but without a focus on the discussions, they could easily agree about the sorry state of education without finding points of clarity or potential solutions. And dialogue about social issues and policy is key to checking dogmatism. Solves critical thinking and turns their impact. Keller, 2001. Policy education must be employed to ensure students acquire the requisite policy practice skills and perspective structure. Student debates have great potential for promoting in-depth knowledge of substantive topics relevant to social policy. Debates allow students to develop skills that may translate to political activities. Debates stimulate critical thinking by shaking students free from established opinions. Critical thinkers acknowledge the imperative to argue from the opposing sides of view. There are many legitimate points of view, each of which may yield some level of insight. Doubt, confusion, and conflict resulting from discussion of diverse perspectives force comparison, selection, and reformation of ideas and meanings, clinging to the certainty of one's beliefs. Of dogmatism and institutionalism. Only debates about engaging institutions can produce social change. Disengagement from politics fractures coalitions and reinforces conservationism. 2009. There is emphasis upon critique as well as withdrawal. They see tradition representing politics as inherently oppressive, so they not seek to engage with them in order to challenge them. They seek to get rid of them. They advocate a withdrawal from existing institutions. Radical politics today is characterized by a feeling that the state itself is inherently the problem. They deny the positive role of political struggle, describing the way in which meaning is given to institutions or practices. For example, the way in which a given institution or practice is defined as oppressive to women or racist or environmentally destructive. Every hegemonic order is therefore susceptible to being challenged by counter-hegemonic practices, feminist, anti-racist, environmentalists. This is illustrated. Clearly not all are worker struggles. They have nevertheless attempted to influence and have influence on a new hegemonic order. This means that when we talk about the political, we do not lose sight of the ever-present possibility of heterogeneity and the antagonism within society. Demands which challenge the hegemonic order are recuperated by the existing system, which is achieved by satisfying them in a way that neutralizes their subversive potential. Radical policies is not about withdrawing. We had no other choice but to engage with hegemonic practice in order to challenge them. If we instead choose to simply escape the state, we can leave the door open for others to take control of systems or authority of regulation. The state is seen as a monolithic apparatus for domination that cannot be transformed. A properly political intervention is always one that engages with a certain aspect of existing hegemony. Another important aspect of politics lies in establishing linkages between various demands. This is further reason why the critique involves engagement. The aim is to create common bond and collective will, engaging in the wide range of institutions with the aim of transforming them. Now, on to CAP. Gender inequality is not the historical product of the abstract system of patriarchy. It's the result of class societies organized around the exploitation of surplus labor. CLAP 2003. To challenge oppression, it is important to know where it comes from. Historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists tell us that pre-class society sexism was unheard of. Arisen particular kinds of societies, class societies, oppression are not endemic to human nature. They were created in the interest of ruling classes. Anthropologists confirm people would accumulate surplus It was possible to order and control distribution as communities became more complex, social organizations surplus grew, distribution of wealth became unequal. There had been a sexual deviation of division of labor without a hierarchy of value. Division of labor is when men did the heavier work, hunting and animal agriculture became a system of control over resource distribution. The new system required more workers and sought to maximize women's reproductive potential. Women became associated with a reproductive role, losing control over the production. Marxists have not dismissed the oppression of women, and ideologies pit men against women, encourage us to fight each other rather than organizing together. And struggles against capitalism are a necessary starting point for breaking down patriarchal domination. Smith, 1983. We must look to capitalism as a mode for production to find out how the notion of the separation of gender relations from economic relations could arise. To posit a distinct sex-gender system is to inhibit analysis and understanding of these gender statute character of social relations by sectioning off those involving women. They're as much in class part of the class and class struggle as men. Gender relations are, as I shall try to slow an integral constituent of the social organization of class, are implicated in larger organizations of society, even if we see the patriarchal principle at work in each new setting. And their focus on personal bodily experience and self-knowledge makes resistance politics overly subjective. The objective historical materialist process must be preserved in its totality to produce concrete political action. Luke 67. It becomes impossible to impose a subjective will upon the facts or to discover them in any directive action. The dialect materialism is the only approach to reality when they give an action or direction. The self-knowledge of the proletariat is the same time knowledge of the state of development achieved by the whole society. The ultimate goal is not an abstract idea, but an aspect of truth and reality. Is a concrete meaning to comprehend it, to recognize the direction it takes towards the totality. Marxist orthodoxy is the eternally vigilant prophet, proclaiming the relation between the task of present and the totality of the historical process, and the aspect deconstruction of difference does not fix ableism. Capitalism is the root cause, and only material resistance can prevent it. Professor Watson, 14. Disability is rooted in the economic structures and demands redistribution of wealth. The problems of disabled people face require more than ideological change, and ideological change is of the old elusive. It does not result in material change. CDS failed to account for the economic basis of disability. Marketization has pervaded all societies, coupling economic mechanisms of distribution with cultural patterns of value. Markets are not controlled by culture. As a result, they generate economic inequalities. They are not of identity hierarchies. The advantage related to the disability is a matter of economic injustice. Both the social and the physical mechanism they produce human diversity are real, and when they produce tangible differences, they cannot be challenged. Difference group identities have invaluable tools of resistance. And modern racism is fundamentally economic, looking for greater sources of profit and cheap labor. Capitalists institutionalized slave labor and justified their atrocity through manufacturing of ideological narratives of inferiority in the concept of race itself. Class 2003 racism is not just an ideology, but an institution. Racism originated with capitalism and the slave trade, that the only justification by which humanity could face it was to divide people into races and decide that the Africans were an inferior race. Before the emergence of colonialism and slavery, there is no evidence of any systematic system of racial organization and discrimination. As slavery replaced indentured servitude, the economic demand caused by racism to become more and more virulent. That is racism clearly connected with the card.
Alright, well those are right.
Yeah.
Okay. First on framework, how should we engage in politics if it's exclusionary?
Well, what we're saying is that, like as our cards said at the beginning, if I don't want me to read them, what they said is like how that the only way to fix it is to engage in politics, and that.
Yeah, how
but no, but your
USFP?
idea that the U.S. federal government is like permanently the way it is and cannot be fixed is flawed.
Well, we don't say that it can't be fixed. Okay, that's fine. So. If we win that like status quo, like resolutional focus, like really state-based is bad, is that a reason to vote F?
Wait, can you repeat that?
Like if we win that like a resolutional focus, like on purely the state is bad, is that like can the F win? Or what do we have to do?
Well, we said that you can engage in these social issues, but we would rather they have a plan.
You can engage in social issues?
You can engage in these social issues, but if you can provide like a plan so that there can be two sides, because if you're just advocating for something, then there's no like switch side debate, as Mike Carr's talked about, like how it's
So you can engage. Okay, that's fine. Why are simulations key? Like what education
simulations are key because simulations allow people to adopt a negative role in something. It's because someone's allowed to adopt a negative role, you can see like the benefits of the positive and the negative.
Yeah, how are we not providing that like viewpoint? Like how are we ignoring that when we can obviously discuss methods of like resistance?
Because when you introduce something like patriarchy or stuff like that, of course everybody would be in agreement that that is something that is not a good thing. But when you're not allowed to debate a planned text.
Well, why can't we have a discussion of methods that could be productive and ways to solve for that or ways to do so? Why can't we do that?
Why can't we just have a discussion of like the way?
Why can't we have methods like debate?
Okay. Like what do you mean by methods?
It's okay. That's fine. On cap, what's the alt?
What's the alt?
Mhm.
What do you mean what's the alt? Oh, we're just saying that like capitalism is like the root cause, like how.
Yeah, what card is specifically like a reason? Like what's the alternative?
Is there one?
Is there one?
Doesn't seem like there was one.
No, I mean like our alternative is just saying that like cap is the root
So it's
cause.
just a
and that you should
dissad saying
reject-
that
Yeah, just
it's
reject
ridiculous.
it. Like reject.
Okay, why should we have a monolithic view of oppression?
Monolithic view of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Which card are you referring to?
Just like your root cause claims.
Oh, well, our root cause claims are just that like because capitalism and like how capitalism didn't exist in these cultures and Paleolithic cultures, that capitalism causes this, so we could solve for the
So,
problems in this.
We have to
and-
solve for cap because that's like the only way to solve for all oppression, essentially.
Well, yeah, that's what we're saying. We're saying that cap. was
Yeah,
the
how
root
is
cause
cap
of
is the root cause?
slavery,
How is
ableist-
cap the root cause of like a
ableism.
formation of intersectional oppression? It's not like individual, but like how do you get that like, I guess form of like, how do you solve for intersectional oppression?
We solved because when capitalist structures occurred, what ended up happening was it forced people.
Yeah, but what
to
about people
modify
who
other
are like a
people.
person of color who is impoverished but also a woman? Like what do they do? It's in the alternative.
Yeah, well, that's not
Perfect.
speech.
Okay, sure.
Okay, I sent it out. And the word's gonna be case CAD framework. Okay, is anyone not ready? Cool. In affirmation of a utopia, freedom, masculine surveillance is essential. One of the teals that benefit creates better strategies to deal with pressing issues. We never think we promote patriarchy. We constantly strive to create satisfying strategies for living and more comprehensive strategies to transcend satisfying strategies means our efforts react to any alternative political action. Choosing the catharsis that benefit utopianism is a survival strategy to transcend the status quo where determination implicit and introduction of a patriarchy in everyday interpersonal relations. Patriarchy's universe will not monolithic. It manifests itself in different ways across class, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, ability, artistic trends, status, gender violence, norms, and everyday reality, constantly in normalizing and depoliticizing sexual assault, feminized murder, domestic abuse, sexual slavery, patriarchy, strict women's bodies, driving, you separate them into different categories and placing about devaluing the expression of femininity, causing unique violence against trans women that's array and Serrano evidence. The implementation of the advocacy, the manifestation of feminist utopianism is not about achieving a perfect world, but about what the imagination and possibility does to challenge non-notion of huge being power, which bodies matter. They've conceded our entire permanent peace using greater 100% truth. Now go on to cap. Evaluate the nature of the lens of utopia, statical governmental governmentality, where the transpose social interactions and describe as solutions to oppression, the elite and institutions they occupy, and attempt to bracket out any challenge to the patriarchal domination. Utopianism transcend the consequences that encompasses their alternative transcends the current notion of what is possible. Now they don't read an alt card, their claims about rejecting capitalism and historical materials from art and actual alt text or alt solvency have a very high threshold for all explanation in the body because they practically know what is the alternative. And also read offense on the alt case. You think they have one, they're still white, and one individual able to see that the non-class based oppression experience within the always affirmed to assault and residual link to the after two that all prevents a individual analysis of precedent subject petition after this set to the that historically anti-capitalist movements justified for gender violence by ignoring sexual assault when their movements. The Occupy movement had an anti-rape just because leaders refused to call the authorities for instance sexual assault because it would make the movement look bad. Now whatever coalition they create, the people within them, even after the anti-capital have internalized patriarchy because only raising the active action about that are solved for coalitions or reconceptualization of the status quo. This is how opposite in opposition dichotomies is necessary to move the step away from the overdetermined telos of Marx and the universal overdetermined and escapable force is necessary to pull free compensation to the binaries who save the nets, interpretation capitalism are free from non-capitalist components is Lloyd and 11 we can press more problem than counter by feminist and to reconceptualize financial is not possible to posit financial and opposite potentially substantial heritage recalls like this certain critical methodology to seek to watch confront finance but to do so critically undermines the institutions and everything saying here on campus and finance capitalism all the involved which occurs as it was how they could have that rule capitalism may seem more nuanced action anti-social power movement from the job and constructed and criminal theory but seek to unveil capitalism other than the ontological totality. The point here is that of course to break away from one size to all account of capitalism in order to fight real life is only power which is on manifest open points of engagement. There's no capitalism, only capitalism. Now anti-capitalist struggles silence women and feminine try to justify sexual violence. This particular type of transition works that extends patriarchy, human global scale, utopianism is necessary and sufficient political method to approach a problem intersectionally which resolves all other potential link arguments, gender, and 13, a condition occupied by the to be the jail for as a mother, 5-year-old about work, a proposal for official policy wants to do a lot of levels for these 3 sex offenders, but all the Russian women playing bullshit that's about rape from India would be high school jobs and 2 billion were come back down for Republicans from the stories about work, college, apples from my own city were 4 full course meetings leading up to a vote on proposed men are overwhelming people who commit rape and their victims, overwhelming women and children. I'm sure this has nothing to do with the fact how willing people, including some of them that I currently even have before the rape takes place, the people who got noticing against sex offender proposal will tell us we relax and we blame others for bad behavior that won't generally work to be trusted apparently. I should include the pregnant says rape is real, but occupies around the country have to deal with such and sexual resolve those who are arresting our best movement or the wrong to items who respect this radical setting that we wouldn't have to make completely solidarity in my act. They always seem puzzled when I don't smile back now. There is utopia challenge happens by a complicated notion of having a nuclear family heterosexual coupling that structures the way families and communities are expected to be productive labor units of labor and economic gains. So we're guided in 97 like a advice where Western cultures and emergence of industrial capitalism and center on the maintenance of reproduction, the birth of families through heterosexual coupling and marriage, specifically capitalism and man's restriction, family and gender inclusion, patterns and weakness of imagining politics differently, the to fiction is imagined in a futuristic setting to all test alternative relations to the civil society, what opens the state for group categories of capital, nature, capitalism and heterosexual coupling, and flipping narratives, services, and vital for a little function, right? Society and straight and a approach for social and change from the feminist view with theoretic side ideas from rising communal and nuclear family jobs, psychological well-being, more than technological advancement or economic gains, related, racial and economic progression, which divide, labor, according to skill, desire, not gender, which essentializes the role of our government, reproductive law, will subvert the sex, chemistry, rights, and morality, sexuality, for regulations that's enduring alternative sexual practice and affirm to affirm to the African analyzed capitalism, the African reacts that we tell me thinking of some imaginative capacity, we necessary humanity, capitalism, the capitalism is historically connected to capitalism. We said, liberalism and long been home to some new development towards financial critics of donating and something new illustrating political forces once again take the rule has the dominant ideology that they do the conservation of every existing regimes, liberalism and endorsements, piecemeal, our performance of the only acceptable political course in market. Of course, now there's no root cause of patriarchy and capitalism are entangled, which came first question, they're useless, even the way that capitalism and the root cause, if you're looking for strategies to deal with the ways the system manifests themselves now. Capitalism, the tool of patriarchy that we use it, capitalism is a tool that patriarchy uses to enforce gender violence. It's not the origin of the all can't explain why women are excluded from politics in the first place. When you say the affirmative prejudice go on to framework. 1. Accessibility. So the opponent is a prerequisite to accessing the law. The family, the hanky down moral and canon. What is the evidence demonstrating the nexus allegation law from names? Reasonably cannot be separated from patriarchy and there's room the accessibility law for women. Thus the separating essential questions from theoretical claims of fairness and limits and movement hegemonic masculinity. So very card. Now discussing resolution is limited to how internal deception surveillance perpetuates vast amounts of pressure. That's a shovel card counter-interpretation after the resurrection of the resolution. We meet the after surveillance. Your refusal to consider the true surveillance has any conflict eventually would have will impact her. The current last time is a critical form of political issue they engage in that opens the space for events that ways out what to do in the future, provides critique and advocacy to great feminist practices of society and mechanical argument is the only way to demand institutional response because utopianism takes resistance and forces to reconcile the institutions and it will hence the plan. Now no key version the afterlife not say isolated solution to gender sounds co-opted revolution potentially destroys creativity and epistemologically lost us into the status quo. Dabrowski and 915 times talking to me cooperative for the details that definitely was to the insurance and the surveillance practices have to be virtualizing industrial companies and advantages that interventions into to evolve police to backfire because we imagine surveillance practices to be sufficient to recall to lines of dealing of other more creative solutions the only matter of interveners in the solution situation seems to be our close individuals are saying it seems like only possibly the primary response to violence or communal and that's state driven. We don't see other solutions to problem violence because we also become absolved from having to see the violence in the first place. Now all their clash arguments around what is a tier and normal in the community. We give you plenty of clash by encouraging new ways to methods to solve. We don't preclude you from proving why our methods by switch type lead to quantify ethics and the approval of the value of education that the app creates which is necessary in a place in the debate community and predictability is inevitable. The cases can't files and infiltrate make all our arguments irrelevant. Now even if that isn't true, common starting points destroying the beauty and the community requiring totalitarian conformity silencing all voices don't conform to majoritarian decision. You can't take framework because it is an approach to debate. Even if they don't get what for framework, we still will debate if we want to have our model of debate is productive, it's independent reason, but ask CK and UK benefits solve opposition on community decisions. I have commonality of choice and she decisions of testing for comical community with the outcome of the reasonable agreement why it's been able to continues to assume commonality of person in the community enjoy all class and the same state assumes rational interlocutors in theory practice exclusive groups individuals can win who have to emotional rather and corporate rather than rational minoritarian groups who do not adopt the authority discourses that very rational changes in the idea of communication fails beyond multiplicity meetings features some singular content all communication rise contradiction minority groups and see discourse freely ignored from political sections decision making because they don't adopt the equality modes of the order of conversation and consume conditionality and transparency. Now the app is the best internal link to political engagement. We understand the government and realize what it is done. We criticize the approach as a whole is going better than any leftist version the app today can come up with. Now, yeah, okay, cool. Cross-links. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So since you're reading the first utopia, like what does it actually do? Like what difference does it make to this round, like in particular? Like,
Yeah, sure. So I guess if you're talking about like our in-round solvency, we'd indicate that the education that we create and like the affirmation of a feminist utopianism as a good method for breaking down oppression is going to be pretty valuable.
Okay,
We'd indicate that our 40
yeah, that's fine.
discussion.
But like all of your cards talk about like how like almost insurmountable the patriarchy is and how ingrained it is in our society, right? So
That doesn't mean that we should not strive to
no,
work
that's
against the
not
patriarchy.
what we're not strive. But what makes you think that your debate right now about methodology will solve patriarchy?
Okay, first of all, our act is an active step against the patriarchal foundation of society, the way that, I guess, the way that society relegates women to the privacy, or the way that surveillance hurts women, the way that surveillance hurts women in the status quo, and that's ignored by policymakers. There's only a risk that our act creates better education to actually take down these harmful practices in the status quo. Just because, patriarchy is a pretty big deal doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive against it. Our act is a necessary first step.
So you're saying that you just methodologically question things, but like
I don't know when the 1AC is just like a questioning. We have a very material strategy in which we create a feminist utopia that has a new feminist jurisprudence, which is going to create new, I guess, ways of thought and ways that society works.
If you say that the patriarchy is so insurmountable,
conditions in which the human is struggling to survive and create living conditions accessible solely to the richest, which cause a degeneration of human as being. For capitalism, man is merely means of its own reproduction. Transformation of nature into a surrogate are capital's effort to achieve complete commercialization of both natural and the social environment. Such a qualitative rise and destruction in humankind have been performed that life on the planet is literally facing a countdown. And also, as my partner said in his first speech, the gender classes that they're talking about come from capitalism. It started when social classes developed. Women were expected to stay home, men were expected to work. Women were expected to raise the children, men were expected to work. The initial idea of patriarchy started with the social classes. And moving on to case, we need to use a utilitarian point of view. Evaluating using utility encompasses all impacts, Isaac 2. The purity of attention does not ensure the achievement of what one intends. And in real world violence, moral purity is complicity and justice. Politics is about unintended consequences. It is the efforts rather than the motive that is significant, often the pursuit of good, generous people. We need to take the utilitarian approach. We can't just focus on women. We need to be encompassing everybody. If we eliminate capitalism, it's going to create equality for many people. They ask about intersectionality, like what would a poor black woman do? If we eliminate capitalism, it's still going to eliminate this gap. It's not only going to solve for gender inequalities by having both gender equal, but it's also going to have race equality and will help with poverty levels. And also, they said that they stressed the point that no other form of utopia creates the same equality. However, they never actually give an example of a utopia that excludes this equality. And they also made a major point about how it's the woman's body that's been surveilled without permission. They've been surveilled for such a long time, and that it's the male body that is now having the same issue, and that's why we're having surveillance reforms. And this may be true, but also, again, take the utilitarianism approach. We need to look at all types of genders, all types of races. We need to include all of this, and by eliminating capitalism is the cause, and that will fix it. And also, even if that doesn't, even if you don't buy into that, then what difference does it make if it was males who started feeling oppressed to be eliminating surveillance? Because it's going to be benefiting both genders either way. It's still going to be eliminating that surveillance of women that they are so that they advocate to eliminate. So, open for questions.
Good? Yep. Okay. How does imagining a world without a masculine deity, how does a feminist utopia recreate capitalism?
A feminist utopia doesn't necessarily recreate
So what's the link?
But capitalism is the root cause.
That's not a link. Is there a link to the plan? Or, sorry, the affirmative.
The link to the affirmative is that,
does the action of the one recreate capitalism in any way?
It's recreating the ideas that were initially instated by capitalism.
Okay, how?
Because capitalism started with a socioeconomic class.
Okay, sure. How does rejecting the act break down, like, I guess, the relegation of women into the private sphere?
Our argument is that, like, capitalism as a factor was what led to the problem.
Sure, I get your root cause argument. I'm asking what the alternative does
So
about the
our
relegation of
argument
women
is
into the
that
private sphere.
if you try to have a feminist utopia without, like, first examining the capitalist structures which cause the problems that you're trying to
Cool,
solve
cool.
for,
So again,
then
what
that's
does the
not
alternative do
possible.
for the relegation of women to the private sphere?
For eliminating capitalism, the capitalism was the root.
cause of the private
Okay,
sphere.
I understand the root cause evidence. I'm asking about your alternative policy. What does your alt do for women who are relegated to the private sphere as a result
Well,
of
it breaks
capitalism?
down. It breaks down. No, it breaks down this idea of like quantification, or like that, like you have like to be necessarily relevant, or
How does voting
you have to
do
be able
that?
to do. You have to be able to do work, and that's what this capitalist structure was talking about, as our evidence talked about, which was the fact that the only reason
Cool, how does
that
voting men do
sexism
that?
occurred was because of the fact
Yeah,
that they're like,
okay.
oh
Cool.
crap,
I have
guys
some
can lift
questions.
things.
But,
And then they just ended up dissecting that and having this dichotomy, and
Yeah,
that's
cool.
caused by capitalism.
I get
so
it.
we need
Thank
to show
you.
that first.
yeah, thanks. Cool. So if the app like has a, I guess a reason, like if the app has a way to solve capitalism or examine capitalism, that means you have an ethical reason to go app. As if you're like ethical ending, there's a great creation of capitalism, and ethical reason to go end. If there's a risk that the problem solves, then it's that just not mean you go app.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't really understand.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
okay.
sure.
Okay, sure, that's cool. So our status quo state approaches to policy an example of utilitarianism.
Well,
Does the United States federal government in the status quo use util to justify its policy?
I mean, right now the United States is. I'm sorry.
So like when the state creates policies in the status quo, does it like use that basis of utilitarianism?
I mean,
Would you
it makes
argue?
the idea, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is utilitarianism.
Okay, so I guess when has like, can you give me like an empirical example when utilitarianism has solved like marginalized bodies or like taken accounts of women into like policy making or like util approaches?
Well, it's not necessarily that it is solved, is that we need to take a utilitarian approach to solve for the most people.
Okay, sure, that's fine.
Yeah, I'll know that.
Can you send it out?
Yeah,
Okay.
I know. Yeah, should have sent.
Any religious framework, right?
I think I'm gonna go. Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna go a little bit over something. The front doesn't cap it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Oh, okay.
Analytics. So. Okay, so first on the cafe, when we talk about the performance, what we're saying is mutually exclusive. You can't solve or have this feminist utopia before solving this capitalist structure, because the capitalist structure is what caused the problems that they keep talking about in the feminist utopia. It's almost impossible to solve for those problems without once realizing what caused those problems in the beginning, and that's what we advocate for, and Cap just dealing with it from there. Okay, now on to framework. I essentially agreeing on the grounds of the debate beforehand is the key to having a debate. It made it structurally impossible to have a discussion which internal link turns solvency because it prevents dialogue. Dialogue about social issues and policy is key to checking dogmatism, self-critical thinking, and their impacts. Keller, 2001. Policy education must be employed to ensure students acquire the requisite policy practice skills and perspective structure. Student debates have great potential for promoting in-depth knowledge of substantive topics relative to social policy. Debates also allow students to develop skills that may translate to political activities. Debates stimulate critical thinking by shaking students free from established opinions. Critical thinkers acknowledge the imperative to argue from a political point of view. There are many legitimate points of view, each of which may yield some sort of insight, doubt, confusion, and conflict resulting from discussion of diverse perspectives, forced comparison, selection, and reformation of ideas and meanings, clinging to the certainty of one's belief, race, dogma, dogmatism limits extends time over freely. Their interpretation of debate is useful. Saying patriarchy is bad is obviously true, but that when posting an actual strategy for combating patriarchy, their advocacy is both active and destroys debate. Their ask functionality is preaching to the choir, because right now, of course, we would like to have a debate about this policy, or they could have presented us with something that would benefit women in the political sphere, or through this way that would actually provide broad scale. But right now, they're just introducing a methodology into this debate space that is just preaching to the choir, as I've already said. Because of course we agree that the patriarchy is not a good thing. Anyone who does is just not intelligent at all, but the fact that I can't debate a plan in this debate is completely ridiculous. I don't want to be arguing framework right now, I want to be arguing the benefits of the plan, but I have to because they've introduced something that I cannot argue other than with framework. And extend the ground to gay, their app is solely an ideology. That's problematic because when they choose an ideology like racism or sex and bad, it's structurally impossible to be negative since the only ground we have is method ground. And their withdrawal from institutions is counterproductive. Refusing to engage in institutions prevents effective counter-hegemonic discourse. Instead, the vacuum left from their withdrawal allows the conservative forces to take power, further weakening their movement. And policy key, conservative forces always exist. Only policy discussions can persuade them to support change. Kerbal. There's no dynamic essential to understanding the nature of changing the beliefs of other people. There are forces that seek to change and those that resist it. Both elements are always present. There's a constant interplay between those aspects of society. If you know how to resist it, will play a one can plan and harness the power of resistance to the forces of change. Progressives must have to learn about persuading others to agree a new policy proposal should be essential. And their framework doesn't access policy since 1991. Eco-feminist writings about politics can we afford not to have an action-oriented philosophy when we are threatened by ecological destruction as eco-feminist basis for ethics, interconnectedness, or media by metaphor, the woman nature, they explore the problematic of objectivity in the real world. If an ethic is based on metaphors, it becomes tenuous. Metaphors should not be found. I'm just going to put that there. Also, our interpretation is that the affirmative must defend a topical policy proposal. We have 4 standards. Limits. Only having set forms of limits can we have productive discussion. We have to know what we're going to be talking about before we have a successful dialogue. Lantis cites pedagogical studies of students who gained empathy and wanted to engage groups of oppressed peoples because of the depth of education on fewer topics or opposed to a large group of topics. These unlimited creates an unidirectional conversation or monologue replicating the dogmatism that they criticize. And our model of education doesn't trade off of personal convictions, but it makes debaters stronger advocates. Hodson. Politicization of education can be achieved by giving students opportunity to confront real-world issues that have scientific, technological, environmental dimension. Issues-based approaches can form a basic where students can construct understanding that is personally relevant, can provide experience or situatedness, multidimensionality, and practice. It makes sense to problems and issues in technology, engineering, and the major vehicles for contextualizing the science and research solutions about. I think what the app right now is ignoring is the fact that how things happen in the real world is through the government. That's how they happen. That's how plans get institutionalized. That's how change happens. Just questioning methodology won't really do anything unless you actually engage the government, because they're the only ones at the moment who have the power to be able to make any change. That's what we're trying to say, just because unless we engage in them, actually nothing's going to happen, and they don't really have any solvency because they're just questioning the methodology that no one really disagrees with. So, arguing that current government policy is bad is not role-playing. This idea of debate about role-playing puzzles me. I never once by role-play being part of the government, and I have no idea why it would be oppressive to form an opinion about the government as well. And this answers the Nancy Erickson evidence. They must defend U.S. federal government action, extend the Army to school of American, indicate that resolve mandates of federal action prefer evidence. It's in the context of actual public policy. Their interpretation is not inclusive with ours. It's one interpretation among many possible interpretations of the function of resolve. Their interpretation is terrible because only requires the affirmative to make a firm decision about the resolution destroys them. As there are an infinite number of conclusions that the affirmative may come to talk about the resolution, they can confirm it, they can negate, they can affirm it based on the certain conditions, they can interpret it on the metaphor of any sort of practices, they can actually come in with literally anything, judge about any sort of topic, but unless we keep it to government action, I can't debate the pros and cons of something that's a methodology because it doesn't really have pros and cons because it's something that people agree with. So, yeah.
Alright, cool. 8 minutes to start it now.
KCK framework?
Yeah. Like a, okay. You have to vote affirmative for the following reasons. One, we're able to create a better strategy how to create a utopia. We want to combat the oppression based in these actions. Second, we're able to create jurisprudence, which means that we're able to engage in the politics and actually have access to this in the first place in order to find this also. Third is we're able to combat patriarchy. This is specifically key because then we're no longer having to have the dominant hierarchies in
Starting on the CAPK, we conceded the perm, and so moving on to framework. Judge, my partner and I would love nothing more than to engage in a debate about the benefits of tangible real-world actions. Our solves for the problem that they occur because the idea of an ideological imagined universe. Our position advocates that the act and exchange that exists in the real world and for the most amount of people, because they seem to be unable to realize that the state can be reformed, as was said in the 1NR, and that by imagining a perfect society in their heads, we advocate for the change to be enacted in the real world. Because believe it or not, the real world is based on the idea of policy making for change, and just by imagining a perfect world, one will not just materialize, we need to engage in the state and create tangible solvency in the context of the real world. Judge, they are preaching to the choir, and they themselves are inhibiting their own real world change by refusing to engage in the state. And also, refusing to engage in institutions prevents effective counter-hegemonic discourse. Instead, a vacuum left from their withdrawal allows for conservative forces to take power, further weakening their movement. Our interpretation is that the affirmative must defend a topical policy proposal. We have 4 standards. Limits only by having a set of form limits we can have productive discussions. We have to know what we are going to be talking about before we have successful dialogue. Atlantis states pedagogical studies of the students who gain empathy and wanted to engage in groups of oppressed peoples because the depth of the education on fewer topics as opposed to a large range of topics. Their unlimited creates a unidirectional conversation or monologue, replicating the dogmatism that they criticize. Judge, we need to have an act that is not only topical but also somewhat predictable, which the topic does. We need a plan text to be able to debate the pros and cons. We can't debate on a method. There's no dispute that the United States is a patriarchal society, but we can't debate. And if there's no dispute, there is no clash, and there is no way for us to take a con to their side. There's no way for us to refute what they say. There's no way for us to go on the opposite without. And so moving on to case. It's not just feminism that it's not just a patriarchal society that we need to solve for. We need to solve for all forms of inequality. We need to take a utilitarian approach. They asked if the United States uses utilitarianism to justify their actions. And whether or not the government says that they're taking utilitarianism approach, it doesn't mean that they are. We've already conceded that society is patriarchal, the U.S. doesn't acknowledge that. However, we need to use, there are other steps we need to eliminate before we can eliminate this. I'll say that, and again, the major point was that only now that men are starting to feel oppressed from surveillance that we are solving it, but we need to be solving surveillance as an issue in general to solve for, to take utilitarianism approach. Also, there is no actual solvency. Without a plan, we cannot actually solve for anything because it is not doing anything. Without a plan, there is no, the real world is policymaking. Without a plan, there is no change that is going to affect the real world. And without a change in the real world, we are not going to be able, it's not going to solve for anything because it's not going to change the views or change the approach of anything in actual society.
3:45.
Thank you. Four legs are overrated.
That's actually how I broke my computer last year, was on the tabletop, and then I was about to get my running seat, and then it like fell.
Oh
And then
my.
it broke, and then moved off.
Alright. I'm sorry.
It's okay, I got a new one, it's fine.
Alright, cool. Case, framework.
Case framework.
Is anyone not ready? Okay, cool. Utopianism is a critical strategy in the long term, creates better strategies to deal with pressing issues, means we never think we are done resolving problems, we are constantly striving to increase status for strategies, resulting in more productivity and rapid strategies will be better than any real world policy action that Nick wants us to conform with. The false politics, however, where the affirmative uses, or what the state uses to keep us docile, faltering of all of the united in federal government. This is what justifies sexist and exclusionary politics. We always think the government has our best interest in our minds, which allows them to foster a community of exclusion that props up cultural violence and individuals questioning their choices or individual acts are key to actually break down the impression that these state causes. They have conceded that the state is patriarchal, which means there's only risk that we create new methods and better ways to engage with the patriarchal status quo. Now they say in YouTube, but we are ethically obligated to respond to the suffering and violence of feminist individuals because ethics are more important than that the affirmative is a necessary for us to reconsider past atrocities and prevent future objectives. Women's oppression is always seen as depoliticized and therefore invisible. The women's oppression in a societal restriction of women will never be evaluated in the state's utilitarian utilitarianism. Some mercy protect the old predicate of survival and things are only our compassionate utopianism can solve accepting the suffering of individuals for the sake of hashtag all lives matter undermines the foundation of the rights to life. And some things like the atrocities committed upon women can never be justified. Women have the attitude right now these objections to the amount of suffering we consider in policy making. The states, any utilitarian approach will always put women's oppression on the back burner because they will think, what, how is this affecting men? How is it affecting those empowered means women's struggles and strategies will never actually be listened to because the men's interests will always be put first. That is, they concede that by saying that the state is inherently sexist, which means that there's only risk that our affirmative is a better method to solve. Go on to further. Extender CK evidence is we concede and it lays all of their offense. They force us to start from a common starting point which destroys the diversity of this community, an inclusive place for all. This evidence supercharges these standards, but they are insistent that we start at a universal starting point that they think is a good thing. But the one see proves 100% that this includes feminist others. All their impacts are based around real world education making, policymakers, and productive education when they require this level of sameness and conformity that limits out the multiplicity ideas that could come from these utopia. And a better for education where a starting point comes from a fair and inclusionary place where our subject is legitimacy that they want us to now. Now they say those are the very limits of like, ideal limits, patriarchal, they push us out. In the community, our sequel evidence again is a direct terms or limit standards. You can vote this evidence because they force us to have a common story for destroying creativity and meaning that all feminists, others, all those who are dominating will continually be pushed out of the public sphere. We need to break down these discussion. We need to break down the patriarchal and status quo issues. Our acts of directed to active discussion of political engagement because any political engagement or discussion that happens in status quo will always be exclusionary and preclude any kind of feminist movement because the state doesn't like to listen to women and is inherently patriarchal, which again they conceded that means that you vote after. They say that we don't engage institutions, but again they concede the debate is an institution. Our forwarding our methods in education in this round is uniquely key because there's a 1% risk that we create better education for the community, which way people in the community are patriarchal, and they realize that feminist movements actually have a potential to change the patriarchal society around us. That means that you vote after because we do engage things like institutions by creating a new feminist utopia and a new method of engaging with the world around us that's not exclusionary and actually has a potential for change instead of just asking the state to solve all our problems, which will never actually work because the state again does not like to listen. Women will always like things like utilitarianism to put women's like experiences and situations on the back burner so we can continue to focus on the white male, which they think is going to solve everything. They say that so if the United States government is truly a paternalistic society, that means you vote on the accessibility because any T version of the app is actually not going to solve because it precludes any feminist movement. The state doesn't like to listen when there's only risk that we have a better method in education.
Yeah, that's cool. I vote F at the end of the round. Broad overview for my decision is just I don't think there's any clash happening on the framework flow from y'all's side during the round. There's just too many concessions on the line by line for me to vote on the framework. There's never an answer to the accessibility argument. The state is co-opted now, all policies will fail, right? And so that starting at the point of utopianism is better in the round. There's no topical version of the app to try and mitigate any of their offense, nor are there answers to their specific internal links to education, right? The block and the 2NR on framework come across as more they just sound like overviews, really, right? There's not really a lot of clash happening. You extend the Lantis evidence, right? There's extensions of the limits argument, right? But neither of these arguments are either being contextualized to the 1AC either, right? So I don't have any arguments for why, the type of empathy like the Lantis evidence talks about will resolve patriarchal oppression or, lead to a better model of debate, and it's a better method for engaging, this institution of debate. Those all need to be contextualized specifically to the 1AC you're debating, and that doesn't happen in this round. And then, I just don't really have a clear abuse story or anything to really vote on there either. You say you can't debate on a method, but there's no clear argument you give me of ground you lost, or any sort of story like that for me to vote on either. On case, I would just take the case debate out and the block in the 2NR. Because this Isaac evidence isn't really going to do you anything substantive on a framework debate. I think just waste your time when you could just be spending more time on framework contextualizing, the Lantis evidence, the Shibley evidence, or spinning, how you lost clash in this round and how losing that clash is detrimental to resolving the impacts that the 1AC claims they resolve. So I think at the end of the round, the 1AC is a better method for engaging the institution of debate and for addressing gender violence. Any questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would just give a 2NC, 1NR redo with this 2AC where you just make sure you go line by line on every argument. Make sure you have an answer to the accessibility dissad, since that was most of the 2AR and most of the 1AR on framework. And just work on contextualizing probably are framework arguments to resolve the impasse of the legacy, right? Thinking of it more like a counterplan. Make sense?
I also
Cool.
do have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think, like, was the 1 hour organization okay? Like, is there anything I should change?
Let me see. I think you, organizationally, I think it was fine. I think you probably could have spent less time on the K.
Okay.
Because again, on the K, I think really the only, and like it would be some, like their best chance was to go for framework in the round,
Yeah.
right? On the K, there's conceded reasons why like cap movements are always going to be patriarchal, right? Conceded offense there. And I don't know, there's like if I look at the line by line, there's a bunch of other conceded arguments there.
Yeah.
I don't think you need to spend that much time on cap
Okay.
to win it.
How much time do you think I should like spend on that then?
Ooh.
Like, is there like an approximate time? I mean, I don't know, just like less, I guess. Sorry.
You probably don't need much more than a minute on that flow.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else?